like to thank you all for coming and welcome you to our panel today on the state and future of democracy in Turkey. Over the past few weeks, we have watched a series of events unfold that have evoked a wide range of emotions among the citizens of Turkey. We have hit unprecedented levels of both sadness and of joy, and taken pride in the spirit of our nation as it has come together in solidarity amidst this crisis. Today's panel has been organized by members of the community and with the leadership of Professor Mustafa Koç of Ryerson University, without relation to any association or group, in the hopes that we can better understand what is happening and where we are going. On that note, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Feyzi Baban, who is joining us via Skype. He's from the he's a professor of international development studies at Trent University. We also have Professor Sabina Dreyer, of the professor of international studies at York University Glendon campus. And of course, we have Professor Mustafa Koç, who we are very grateful to for leading the organization of this panel today. And he is a professor of sociology from Ryerson University. So on that note, thank you very much for all coming, and I hope you enjoy the panel. We have a short video that we'd like to present to you before we start, and I'd like to ask some help.
The biggest civil uprising in the history of the Turkish Republic kicked off in Istanbul at 5 a.m. on Friday morning. Turkish media downplayed the protests as the unrest spread like wildfire across more than 60 cities. The footage showing police brutality against protesters shocked viewers around the world. So far, more than 4,000 people have been injured.
Well, it's good night, everybody from Istanbul. If I look a little disoriented, I apologize in advance, because right now I cannot see you. I'm sort of talking into a darkness, and it's 1:30 in the morning, so it's the combined effect of it. I may be a little disoriented. I think Mustafa and Sabina is going to, have a pretty good analysis of what's going on. If you want, I can give you a little bit of a eyewitness account what happened in the last couple of days, because I've been hearing the movie, and say a couple of things about what happened after the movie ended and what's happening in Turkey right now. Perhaps that might be more interesting, because I've been here now for 10 days, and when I arrived in Istanbul, that was the time period where police left the park, and both park and the square was completely free. And it was very interesting for me to see it, because it's my entire life. That was one period in my life, actually, where I experienced a public place in Turkey without state and without police. And that was quite an interesting experience, and I think there's going to be a lot to be said and written about that experience. And everybody knew that was not going to be lost for a long time, but that brief period, and I was there for an extended time period, both in Taksim and the Gezi Parkı. And it was, I think, a great deal of learning for lots of people, sharing, solidarity, and I think as Sırrı Süreyya said, lots of people who wouldn't normally actually come together got together both in the square and in the park. In some cases, for instance, Kemalists and BDP and Kurdish activists, the feminists, the nationalists, and the LGBT movements. There were interesting exchanges. But that was actually the power of the public engagement, and that public engagement actually had a profound impact on lots of people. But again, as I said, lots of people knew that wasn't going to stay that way. And last Tuesday, the state moved in and they cleared the square, but they promised that they weren't going to touch the park. So they cleared the square. And that was rather brutal, because both Taksim, Kasımpaşa, Karaköy, all the way, and Beyoğlu, all those areas were under intensive tear gas. And it lasted approximately 24 hours, and the square was cleared, and the park was intact, and the spirit was up and intact in the park. And there were some positive signs coming from the government. The Prime Minister came back from North Africa, and first, he gave these rather negative signals, and then he started accepting some people and group and talking to them. Some of them were quite bizarre, but their last meeting was with the Taksim Solidarity Group. And there was some kind of a semi-agreement between the Taksim Solidarity Group and the Prime Minister, and everybody was actually quite hopeful. And there were several forums actually in 2 days. And there was a consensus that there was going to be 1 or 2 tents to be left on Gezi Parkı for information purposes. And then the struggle would continue on different forums. There were some debates about that, but nevertheless, I think the general understanding was that the park side of this struggle was going to wind down slowly and then move on to the next stage. But last Monday night, quite unexpectedly, and at least for the people in the park, were quite unexpectedly, because there were lots of social events was happening, Saturday night, I made a mistake, Monday night, Saturday night. There were children in the park. The police moved in, and police moved in extremely harshly with tear gas, kicking and taking the tents down. It was a pure and sheer police brutality, unexpected police brutality. I wasn't at the park on Saturday night, but at around 9 p.m., I would say that the whole city erupted. I was in Osman Bey, and starting around 9:30, 10 o'clock, thousands of people started going on the street and trying to walk to Taksim Square. The police cut the roads going to Taksim Square, and all the way from Mecidiyeköy, Osman Bey, Harbiye, Pangaltı, Kurtuluş, Nişantaşı, and then Sıra Selviler, down from Karaköy, Beşiktaş. Thousands of people were trying to make their way to Taksim Square. I would say that I've been living in this neighborhood for 47 years now. Parts of it, of course, in Canada, but that's where I grew up, including the time period prior to September 12th. I can safely say that I haven't experienced such police brutality that I experienced in the last 2 days, that Saturday night and Sunday. It was almost like a scene from Civil War, and the amount of tear gas that used, and the style of the tear gas that used, because the police actually is not supposed to shoot the tear gas directly to protesters, but unfortunately police actually shoots the tear gas directly towards protesters, which actually resulted quite a significant number of people being injured, losing their eyes. There's still a 14-year-old teenager in the hospital because he got a tear gas capsule hit his head. So that Saturday night and Sunday was actually a rather bleak and extremely, extremely depressive day, because it felt like a police state. And while, of course, this was happening on Sunday, the Prime Minister had his gathering in Kazlıçeşme. So the irony of it is that the half of the city was under tear gas, locked up. All these areas in Nişantaşı, Osman Bey, Harbiye, Şişli, Mecidiyeköy, they were actually a de facto curfew in a way, not declared, but de facto, because the moment that you actually step outside or somehow try to walk on the street, the police were indiscriminately firing the tear gas. But while this was happening, thousands of people were being shuttled and carried to Kazlıçeşme for the government's gathering. And I think the symbolism of it was quite clear, because the message that came from the Prime Minister that particular day was very divisive and polarizing. He made it very clear that the people who took part in these protests, and the people who were banging the pots and pans and occupying the Gezi, from time to time he paid a lip service to good-intentioned protesters. We don't know who they are, but the majority were riffraff and Jews. And they didn't actually represent the Turkish nation. The Turkish nation were in Kazı all unified in one voice. So Istanbul actually last Sunday felt like an extremely divided, very tired and beaten down city. So this was a sort of, the overall experience of what happened once the Gezi Park was taken down. As many of you, of course, know, Monday morning, everything was clear, the park was empty. They removed everything and they started planting trees and flowers. And they actually, ironically, they planted 100 more trees apparently. And my theory is that I think they planted 100 more trees so that people cannot put tents there anymore, because practically there's no place to put tent anymore. But since then, and since Monday, the atmosphere in Istanbul is still quite tense. The protests continue on Monday night, and Tuesday it slowed down, but then again, as some of you may be following, the Standing Man protest started, and that has been going on, and it has been going on quite strong all around Istanbul and different parts of the Istanbul. And right now we're in a sort of a transition period where everybody's trying to understand where we're going from now, because I think this spontaneous eruption, not an organized eruption, but this spontaneous eruption that happened in Turkey was unexpected for many, and the direction that we're going is right now quite unknown. But I would like to say a couple of things so that I wouldn't take too much of your time. But there are three things emerged since the Gezi Park incident, since the clear-up of the Gezi Park incident. The one is, of course, and it's quite clearly both the government and the Prime Minister, they adopted a strategy of polarization and divisiveness. In Prime Minister's public gatherings, that's quite clear, that he makes a differentiation between the 50% who voted for him and the other 50%, and we don't know how much of it is riffraff, how much of it is a good-intentioned protesters, how much of it are criminals, but nevertheless, they more or less belong to the same group. So this, rather than acknowledging a wrongdoing, there is a polarizing and divisive attitude coming from the government. The second, of course, is that the external dimension of it, because the government, again, decided to polarize its relation with the outside world as well. So from European Union to international media, to international finance, the United States, Israel, you name it, they're all part of the conspiracy. So it is obvious that the government thinks, and the Prime Minister thinks, that there is there's an external conspiracy directed precisely against him to take him down. So everything and everybody was lumped into that, even though there are some external elements in that. It's indiscriminately, everything was put into this. So there is a rather confrontational stance with the outside world as well. And then the third dimension is the peace process, because as you know, right before the Gezi protests started, the peace process with PKK and the Kurdish movement started, and right now that's in a very precarious situation. During the Gezi protests, the BDP and the Kurdish movement, they actually stayed rather distant from the protests. The BDP gave some qualified support to protesters, but they actually haven't actively participated, and that was probably a strategic decision on their part. And while this process was going on, they did not want to rock the boat with the government, at least for the time being. But it is becoming quite clear that there are expectations, and if the government doesn't move quite quickly, the peace process would be very much in danger. And it is quite questionable that how quickly and how much the government actually can move at this particular juncture while they're trying to consolidate their own base. So when we look at this sort of three aspects of this issue right now, at least in my personal opinion, a government who declared half of the population of its opponent, who declared the outside world its opponent and enemy in a very precarious situation with the Kurdish movement. This is a government extremely vulnerable, but this is also a country it's very difficult to govern. This is not a sustainable situation. If this polarization and if this confrontational stance continue, then I cannot see actually how Turkey can stay stable or can be governed, both these internal and external divisions. One interesting thing is that the things change quite quickly, day by day, sometimes actually an hour by hour. There are some promising, at least, signals coming from some elements of the government, not from the Prime Minister at the moment, but at least from President and some members of the government in trying to soften the tone. And there are some very faint signs that the government is maybe acknowledging the gravity of the situation, that they cannot actually continue by polarizing the 50% of the population and declaring the war to the whole world, and then collapsing the peace process that they've invested so much. I think that's what we're going to do now in the next weeks and the months to come, that we will observe this situation, how it's continue. But if I finish my words perhaps with one positive note here, and that positive note is that I think this unorganized eruption was a very clear sign and statement from a significant portion of the Turkish population, is that this country is not willing to accept an authoritarian rule. This country is not willing to accept a one-man rule, and this country is not willing to accept a single worldview imposed on it. The statement was very strong, the reaction was very strong, the content and the form of solidarity was very strong. So, and I think you saw that in the movie too. I couldn't see the movie, but I've been hearing the sound of the movie. The last 2 weeks, I think, have been very inspirational for lots of people, including myself, and that is the one thing that I'd like to finish, that I do have a lot of faith in Turkish society.
Thank you very much, Feyzi. It was just wonderful to hear you. I know it's quite late and you are very tired and you have a trip tomorrow morning, early in that morning. But I would like to ask you how long you can remain with us, or do you want to take some questions and answer them and say bye-bye?
I think that would be good. If I can take some questions, if there are questions, I would answer them, and maybe I'll leave you after that if it's all right with you, Mustafa.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience?
You can press it, there's a button in front. First and foremost, good evening. I was going to ask, what is your opinion of the public forums that the activists are creating across Istanbul and the public parks? Do you see any, can you make any comments about that?
Actually, yeah, that's a very good one, because the protests now are continuing in different forms, and that's precisely actually what the Taksim Solidarity suggested right before the brutal takedown of the Gezi Park. Last night, I was in Abbasal Park, and Abbasal Park is right behind Beşiktaş. That was one of the big parks, and that was one of the parks that the people identified as one of the public parks. Actually, there was a piano concert. The Italian pianist, now his name is not coming to my mind, but on Friday night, I believe, that he actually had a concert on Taksim Square starting around 9 o'clock, and he played until next morning. And then they briefly arrested him and his piano as well. But his piano was released 2 days ago. So he was at Abbasal Park, and there was a huge crowd at Abbasal Park. And what actually people are doing right now, not just in general terms, but they are forming committees and discussing the specific issues of the neighborhood, and they're taking control of the issues that are related to those neighborhoods and establishing committees. In some cases that they are pitching tents in those parks. There are some tents in Abbasal, and I know that there are similar situations are happening in different parks. And one of the things that this is why it's so inspirational to me, because what we are seeing right now actually is something we haven't seen before. And that kind of spontaneous organizations are taking place in an extremely civic and civilized way. A well-organized, very well-informed, and a very cooperative and very civilized debate taking place. There are disagreements, but very actually effective and fruitful discussions are taking place. Last night, for instance, in Abbasal Park, people talked about some of the issues in Beşiktaş and some of the ongoing issues with municipality, how to deal with some of the neighborhood issues, and they're planning to continue with this as a way of taking control of the city. And I think this is the impact of Gezi, this eruption of civic mindedness and solidarity and cooperation, and people's ability to take things into their own control. And there is actually, despite all that police brutality, the tear gas, everything extremely depressive, but apart from that, actually there is a very sort of almost light feeling in Istanbul, that people actually feel quite free in terms of expressing themselves. Actually, interestingly enough, they are completely irrelevant. CHP and MHP during this process, that they were on the sidelines and they were completely irrelevant. And the protesters actually made it very clear. I mean, the MHP, of course, by very nature of that political party, that they've been distant to this protest right from the get-go. It's not that something that they would actually naturally feel affinity with. I was just, when I lost connection, I was just saying that the opposition parties are completely irrelevant in this process. The protesters, they did not want to identify with any political party, and CHP, some of the CHP MPs that they gave support and they came protesters, but I could say that in terms of leading, in terms of supporting, in terms of guiding, they have no role whatsoever, but they're also trying to follow this, what's happening right now. Well, I think we still have to, because we're still talking about a 1-year period here, and the earliest one is going to be the local elections. There's no doubt that these protests, they completely turn the nature of Turkish politics upside down. But I think it's quite early to predict what impact these protests are going to have. I think that will all depend on how long these protests will continue, whether it's going to have a transformative effect, whether the protests are going to fizzle out, what impact it's going to have, the AKP's plans and strategies. So there are lots of variables here, but there are a couple of things that we're able to observe. The one thing is that now the Prime Minister's election strategy is becoming quite clear. By looking at his tone and the polarizing and the divisive tone, it's obviously he's trying to consolidate his base, and he's speaking to his base, and by consolidating his base, that he is preparing. Some people think that his desire to become a president now is greatly diminished after these protests, because there is quite a significant amount of AKP votes, not necessarily voting for AKP for ideological reasons, but for various practical reasons. And this is the group of AKP supporters that who may deserve or who may choose not to vote for PKK because of their confrontational and polarizing stance. But we'll have to wait and see that as well, because it's very early to see the impact of this on AKP votes. So we can safely say that I think the Gezi protests were a turning point in the contemporary Turkish politics as it stands right now. But it is a little bit early to predict the impact of these protests on the upcoming elections, I think.
I have the impression it's a very inclusive movement, but I've heard other people characterize it predominantly as a secularist movement. Would you use that word as if you were trying to pick an adjective for this movement, would it be secularist?
I wouldn't necessarily use the word secularist, but I would describe the protesters as urban middle class. I think when we look at the composition of protesters and when we look at the areas where the protests are concentrating, it's definitely there is an urban middle class and upper middle class character to it. But, you know, when you look at in Gezi Park, for instance, that you saw actually quite a significant number of headscarf women, you know, I'm not sure whether they're secular or Islamist, that I hesitate to make those divisions, but they're there. And then there were anti-capitalist Muslims, as they call themselves. That group was in Gezi Park. So in that sense, you know, there is a wide range of coalition. But yes, I think we can safely say that the overwhelming majority of the protesters and the areas where the protests concentrate are mostly urban middle class areas of the city, but also the parts of the city where Alawite and also Kurdish populations are concentrating. So we shouldn't also forget that, you know, when we talk about the urban middle class population supporting these protests, that it is a very significant and strong Alawite contingent, especially the Gazi Mahallesi, for instance. Istanbul was one of the most active places. On Saturday night, when they took the Gezi Park down from Gazi Mahallesi, where police actually tried to stop the movement of people, 20,000 people actually walked on foot from Gazi to Mecidiyeköy and then Osman Bey. I was in Harbiye, and then a massive number of people came from Gazi, and they're mostly Alawite citizens. And despite BDP's distance from the protests, we know that actually lots of Kurdish people also participated. So in that sense, I think, you know, the secular Islamist division probably wouldn't properly explain the composition of these protests.
Please, thank you very much. Have a good evening and have a safe trip tomorrow.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to